Germany, 1939. A 19-year-old young woman arrives by train at a small town north of Berlin. She carries a brown leather suitcase, a couple of photographs of her family, and the certainty that she has found a better job. What she will find instead is a grey uniform, a whip, and absolute authority over thousands of human lives. Inside that train station could have been Irma Grese or Dorothea Binz, or any of the more than 3,700 women who served as guards, Aufseherinnen, in the concentration camp system of the Third Reich. And this is the story of 20 of those women, of what they did and of how they died. Rechen was a village of farmers in Feldberger Seenlandschaft in the northeast of Germany, surrounded by flat fields and spruce forests. On the 7th of October of 1923 in that village, Irma Ilse Ida Grese was born. She was the third of 5 siblings. Her mother, Bertha, committed suicide by ingiriendo acid when Irma was 12 years old. The father, Alfred Grese, was an agricultural worker and could not support the family alone. Irma left school at 14. She worked briefly on a dairy farm, then tried without success to get a position as a nursing assistant at the SS Sanatorium in Hohenliken, an elite medical facility south of where she lived. They rejected her. She kept trying. They rejected her 2 more times. In July of 1942, at 18 years old, Irma Grese was accepted as an Aufseherin in Ravensbrück. The Ravensbrück camp operated 80 kilometers north of Berlin on the shore of a lake surrounded by pine trees. It was built in 1938 as the only camp in the Nazi system designed exclusively for women. But its most important function during the years when Grese arrived was another. It was the central school where the guards who would be deployed to all the camps in Europe were trained. The training lasted between 3 weeks and 3 months. It included instruction on counting procedures, supervision of work commandos, authorized corporal punishment techniques, and familiarization with the ranking system. Also, through the daily example of the most veteran female guards, a gradual absorption of what was acceptable to do to a prisoner. In March of 1943, Grese was transferred to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Birkenau at that time was the epicenter of industrial murder on a continental scale. Since 1942, 4 complexes of gas chambers and crematoria capable of processing thousands of bodies daily were operational. Sector C, where Greece was assigned, housed between 20,000 and 30,000 women at different times. The barracks, most originally built as stables for horses, were uninsulated wooden buildings with wooden platforms on 3 levels instead of bunks, without mattresses, with leaks in the roofs during rain. The smell of the sector was the smell of dysentery, of typhus, of the bodies that had not been able to wash for weeks. Irma Grese supervised that sector. She wore high-top boots with metallic studs on the soles, a pistol at her belt, and a whip braided with wire and cellophane that she had made herself. She had 2 Alsatian dogs that she kept semi-starving. She participated in the selections when the transports arrived, to one side to work. In the actual practice of violence, Grese had developed a repertoire with her own signature. She beat female prisoners whom she considered physically more attractive than herself, forced them to undergo operations for the infections that derived from the beatings without anesthesia. She selected women for Block 25, the death block where those condemned to the gas chambers waited, and deliberately delayed the selections, making fun of those who already knew their fate. The testimonies collected in the file of the Belsen Tribunal cite a recognizable pattern. "Your turn comes on Friday," she would say to the designated prisoners with a smile. In January of 1945, when the Red Army advanced on Auschwitz, Grese was transferred back to Ravensbrück and from there in March of 1945 to Bergen-Belsen. Bergen-Belsen in those final weeks was the most complete chaos. 40,000 prisoners in facilities designed for 10,000, without running water for days, without food distributed regularly, with 14,000 unburied corpses when the British arrived on the 15th of April of 1945. Typhus spread among the barracks. Anne Frank had died there weeks before. Grese was detained on the 17th of April. She was 21 years old. She wore her uniform impeccably ironed. The Belsen trial began on the 17th of September of 1945 in Lüneburg before a British military tribunal. 45 defendants, mostly Auschwitz personnel, transferred to Bergen-Belsen. Grace had the number 9 on the identification badge she wore hanging from her neck during the sessions. For weeks, she listened to the testimonies of survivors who described her with a precision that made any reasonable doubt impossible. She heard how one woman after another told of the same whip, the same boots, the same smile. When the sentence arrived, Grace showed no emotion. They asked her if she had anything to say. She said no. A British journalist who had interviewed her before the trial published that he had asked her why she had committed the crimes of which she was accused. Grace replied without hesitating, "It was our duty to exterminate antisocial elements so that the future of Germany was assured." On the 13th of December of 1945 in Hameln prison, Irma Graese was the second woman to be executed that morning. The first at 9:34 was Elizabeth Volkenrath. At 10:03, Albert Pierrepoint, the official British hangman, executed Grace. The method was the long drop, the calculated fall to break the neck and produce a quick death. Grace was 21 years old and 4 months. She was and remains the youngest woman to die judicially under British law in the 20th century. There were no last words. They called her Die Stute, the mare. The nickname was given by Polish female prisoners in Majdanek, and it sounded like what it was, a mechanical and precise description of her favorite method. Hermine Braunsteiner kicked female prisoners with her steel-toed boots with a regularity that testimonies define as methodical, not explosive, as if it were part of the ordinary procedure of supervision. Hermine Braunsteiner was born on the 16th of July of 1919 in Nussdorf, a neighborhood on the fringes of Vienna, working-class family, strictly Catholic. Her father, Friedrich Braunsteiner, was a brewery driver for 33 years. There were 7 children. Hermine was the youngest. In her testimony before the Dusseldorf tribunal decades later, she recalled the 3-room apartment that the brewery provided them, her parents working without pause, and her own shattered dream of becoming a nurse because the training cost money the family did not have. When her father died suddenly in 1934, Hermine was 15 years old. She had to go to work to help support her mother. She worked as a maid in the house of the brewery baron in exchange for 1 shilling a day, less than the standard rate, but with the possibility of taking some food for her mother. In 1936, she tried to find work in Holland, where one of her sisters lived. She could not obtain a work permit. She returned to Vienna. She found employment in the same paternal brewery on the bottling line, filling bottles, labeling them. Hard work, night shifts, salary of 18 marks a week, of which 5 went for rent and 4.60 for the train. She survived on milk and pieces of cake. In December of 1937, she found an exit. A girl from the neighborhood returned from working in London and told her about an American family looking for a housekeeper. Braunsteiner, who barely knew English, she had learned a few words from a section of the Krone newspaper titled How to Learn English, crossed the channel. The family was that of an engineer who worked for a multinational company and who lived in a 10-room apartment in London. Braunsteiner looked after the house, cooked, cleaned. She remained there until the end of May of 1938, when the Anschluss had already turned Austria into part of the Reich, and rumors of war in England raised fears of the internment of German citizens. She returned to Vienna with the feeling of having demonstrated capability. Back at the brewery, Braunsteiner learned that the regime offered free nursing training for young women. She sent her documents to Berlin, to the central office of the Blue Sisterhood of Nurses. She received no response for months. In August of 1938, with the promised year to the factory recently completed, she signed up at the Viennese Employment Office for a transport of 100 young women destined to work in munitions factories in Germany. They sent her to Grüneberg near Berlin to a factory that probably produced fuses. 2 hours of train a day, night shifts, salary that barely reached. The chief of police of Fürstenberg, the town where she lived, told her of a better opportunity. The commander of the Ravensbrück re-education camp, that is what the policeman called it, he did not pronounce the words concentration camp, was looking for young women to supervise female prisoners. There was accommodation included, hot food, and a salary of between 60 and 70 marks. Good conditions for a young woman without qualifications. On the 15th of August of 1939, 6 days before the war began, Hermine Braunsteiner became guard number 28 in Ravensbrück. She remained there 2 years. The Ravensbrück system molded her with the same efficiency with which it molded all the others. The camp constantly received new transports: German communists, Jehovah's Witnesses, Czech political prisoners, Jewish women. The counts lasted hours, standing in the courtyard under any temperature. Corporal punishments were officially regulated and unofficially daily. Braunsteiner found in that environment not only work, but something resembling a career. When in October of 1942 the first contingent of female guards was called up for the new camp of Majdanek, Braunsteiner was chosen, 10 women in total. On the 16th of October of 1942 they arrived in Lublin in occupied Poland. Majdanek was 3 kilometers from the city center. The chimneys of the crematorium were visible from the highest civilian buildings in the neighborhood. Sometimes, depending on the wind, the smell reached the market. In Majdanek, Braunsteiner rose to Rapport-Aufseherin, coordinating counts and supervising the activities of the other female guards. Her direct commander was Elsa Erich, the Oberaufseherin, a woman whom subsequent testimonies describe as cold, militaristic, who beat with precision and rarity, but with consequences always lethal. Braunsteiner was her closest deputy. What distinguished Braunsteiner in the camp was the frequency and solidity of her physical violence. The historian Elissa Mailander, in her academic study on the female guards of Majdanek based on the Dusseldorf trial files, documents how survivor testimonies consistently point to her as the most brutal after Erich herself, but where Erich beat selectively, Braunsteiner did so with daily continuity. Lola Givner, a survivor who testified in Dusseldorf, described how the mayor walked through the camps and if anyone did not move aside quickly enough, she kicked them without prior warning, threw them to the ground, and kept kicking them until she got tired or was required elsewhere. The children. Several testimonies place her in the selections carrying children by the hair and throwing them onto the trucks going to the gas chambers. Maria Kaufmann-Krasowska, a Polish survivor who testified in 1978, recalled having seen Braunsteiner and Alice Orlowski working in pairs during loading moments. When the truck was full and a child was left without a place, they threw him on top of the piled adults and closed the door. When Majdanek was evacuated in April of 1944 before the advance of the Red Army, Braunsteiner fled westward. She was detained by Austrian authorities in May of 1945. The People's Court of Vienna investigated her between 1946 and 1949 for crimes in Ravensbrück, not in Majdanek, where the file would take decades more to be prepared. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison. She left in 1950. She settled discreetly in Austria, worked in hospitality. In 1958, in Nova Scotia, Canada, she married Russell Ryan, a mechanic for the United States Air Force whom she had met in Europe. They moved to Maspeth, Queens, in New York. Neighbors described her as kind and orderly. She had flowers in the window. She became a United States citizen in 1963. On the 14th of July of 1964, the New York Times published on the front page that a Queens housewife was actually a Nazi war criminal wanted by West German courts. The journalist was Jack Corrigan. Someone had recognized Braunsteiner in the neighborhood and had communicated it to the Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal, who in turn had alerted the newspaper's editorial office. Braunsteiner, upon seeing the journalist at her door, said, "My God, I knew this would happen. They are coming." In 1971, her United States citizenship was revoked. In 1973, after a complex legal process, she was deported to West Germany. She was the first person to be extraditable from the United States for Nazi war crimes. The third Majdanek trial began in Dusseldorf on the 26th of November of 1975. 108 witnesses testified over 474 sessions during 5 years and a half. the longest judicial process in the history of the Federal Republic of Germany until then. The survivors, many over 60 years old, some traveling from Israel, from Poland, from America, appeared one after another to describe what they had seen 3 decades ago. On the 30th of June of 1981, Hermine Braunsteiner Ryan was sentenced to life imprisonment for the direct murder of 80 people, complicity in the murder of 102 children, and collaboration in the murder of 1,000 more. It was the only life sentence among all the defendants. The others received between 3 and 12 years. In front of the court, massive protests. The survivors and their relatives considered the sentences a mockery. Under German law at the time, for a maximum sentence, it was required to link the defendant through direct testimony to a specific and individual murder. And with 40 years of distance, that level of precision was extremely difficult to achieve. Complications from diabetes, amputation of a leg, progressive deterioration, led to her release from Mulheim Women's Prison in 1996. She died on the 19th of April of 1999 in Bochum at 79 years old. Maria Mandl was born on the 10th of January of 1912 in Münzkirchen, a town in northern Austria a few kilometers from the Inn, on the border with Bavaria. Her family was economically stable, affiliated with the Christian Social Party, practically Catholic. She had a childhood without material deprivations and left school at 14 years old, what was customary for a girl of her background in rural Austria of the 20s. When the Anschluss absorbed Austria into the German Reich in March of 1938, Mandl was 26 years old and lived in Munich. The city had become a hub of opportunities for ambitious young people within the new system. That same year, 1938, she applied for a position as a guard at the Lichtenberg camp in Saxony-Anhalt, one of the first camps for women of the Reich. The admission report from her supervisor noted that Mandl possessed extraordinary energy and determination. Lichtenberg was a 15th-century castle converted into a concentration camp. The physical conditions were harsh: cold corridors, old cells, insufficient sanitary facilities for the number of female prisoners that grew every month. Mandl learned her work there under Oberaufseherin Emma Zimmer. The testimonies of Lichtenberg survivors place her beating prisoners until they were unconscious, participating in corporal punishments beyond those officially regulated. In 1939, Lichtenberg closed. The prisoners and the female staff were transferred to Ravensbrück, the new camp built north of Berlin. Mandl arrived as Oberaufseherin, the highest rank within the body of female guards. She was the visible head of the control system of the women's camp, with direct authority over the Aufseherinnen who arrived in waves to be trained. It was in Ravensbrück where Maria Mandl trained Irma Grace. In her testimony before the Belsen Tribunal in 1945, Grace confirmed that Mandl had taught her in Ravensbrück the basic procedures of supervision: how to direct the prisoners in the work commandos, how to maintain order during counts, how to manage discipline. Guard Mandl was very strict, declared Grace. My trainer was Maria Mandl. In October of 1942, Mandl was transferred to Auschwitz to Birkenau. Her position, Schutzhaftlagerführerin, the highest-ranking official within the women's camp. In practical terms, she was the commander of the women's system of Birkenau, with authority over the entire supervision structure of the tens of thousands of women who passed through there. The women's camp of Birkenau had, at its times of greatest overcrowding during the summer of 1944, more than 32,000 inmates in facilities designed for 5,000. The stable barracks had a nominal capacity for 400 head of cattle. Between 800 and 1,000 women slept in them. Lice were endemic. Typhus killed in waves during the winter months. Dysentery was so constant that the specific smell of the women's sector was recognizable at a distance. Mandl supervised all that with a meticulousness that testimonies describe in 2 different but complementary ways. For the guards under her charge, she was demanding, inflexible, feared. For the prisoners, her appearance in the camp meant immediate danger, selection, punishment, in the worst case, the ramp. And then there was the music. It was Maria Mandl who ordered the creation of the Women's Camp Orchestra of Birkenau. the instrumental group formed by prisoners that played at the entrance of the camp when the work commandos left in the mornings and returned in the evenings when the transports arrived at the ramps. The Czech pianist Anita Laska-Wallfisch, an Auschwitz survivor, described decades later the absolute paradox of playing Schubert while the columns of newcomers, many of them directly toward the gas chambers, passed by the musicians. Mandl personally chose Alma Rose to conduct the orchestra. Alma Rose was a Viennese violinist, niece of Gustav Mahler, daughter of the first violinist of the Vienna Philharmonic. Rose had arrived at Birkenau in July of 1943 in a transport from the Netherlands. She died in the camp in April of 1944. The exact circumstances of her death were never completely clarified. In November of 1944, when the German defeat was already inevitable and the Soviet advance made imminent the evacuation of the camps in the east, Mandl was transferred to the Mühldorf camp in Bavaria, one of the sub-camps of the Dachau complex. There, the American soldiers found her in May of 1945, hidden in the mountains of the region. She was extradited to Poland. The Auschwitz trial began in Krakow on the 24th of November of 1947, before the Supreme National Tribunal of Poland. 40 defendants. Mandl was sentenced to death on the 22nd of December of 1947. On the 24th of January of 1948, at 9 in the morning, she was executed in the Montelupich prison in Krakow, the same morning as Therese Brandl and 7 other condemned individuals. The method was hanging. She was 36 years old. She was buried in the prison courtyard. They called her La Binz. The French prisoners used that nickname with the tone with which one names something that one is afraid to pronounce completely. They also called her the real star of the camp, because the formal head of Ravensbrück was completely eclipsed alongside her 22-year-old deputy. And they also called her the White Rose, for the silver coldness of her physical beauty, a nickname that enclosed within itself all the disturbance that she provoked. Dorothea Binz was born on the 16th of March of 1920 in Forsterei Dusterlake, Brandenburg, daughter of a lower-middle-class couple in a village of barely a few dozen houses. She went to school until 15 years old, the standard for her environment. She worked as a domestic maid, a job that, according to the records of her court case, she hated. On the 26th of August of 1939, she volunteered at the local SS office. They sent her to Ravensbrück. The day after the war began. Ravensbrück, 80 kilometers from Berlin, on the shore of Lake Schwedt, surrounded by pine trees. It was built in 1938. From 1939, it operated as the main guard factory of the Nazi system. Through its barracks passed, before being assigned to camps all over Europe, the majority of the 3,700 documented Aufseherinnen. Irma Grese passed through there. Hermine Braunsteiner passed through there. Johanna Bormann passed through there. Binz began under the orders of Oberaufseherin Emma Zimmer, then Johanna Langerfeld, then Maria Mandl. She worked in the kitchen, in the laundry, in the barracks. In September of 1940, she was designated deputy head of the punishment block, the building where official floggings were executed and where prisoners were held in solitary confinement. The career of Binz accelerated with regularity, director of the cell block in the summer of 1942, assistant head of the camp in July of 1943, first informally, then in February of 1944 by official decree. From that position, she had direct command over more than 100 female guards and responsibility for the training of the newly incorporated ones. One of her students was Ruth Closius Neudeck, who would be executed for similar crimes in 1948. What testimonies of survivors describe of Binz is not so much the frequency of the violence as its structure. It seemed designed. Geneviève de Gaulle Antonioz, niece of General Charles de Gaulle, deported to Ravensbrück as a French resistance fighter, described her in her memoirs as someone who exercised power with an almost aesthetic precision. When Binz appeared in the Appellplatz, the roll call square, silence fell over all the prisoners instantaneously before she had said or done anything. It was a communication of pre-verbal terror. Binz had a boyfriend in the camp, Edmund Browning, an SS officer and head of the prisoners' compound. Testimonies describe her walking with him along the camp paths while floggings were executed in the courtyard, or drinking coffee while the prisoners were lined up for roll calls that could last hours in the rain. Several survivors recalled having seen her, alongside Browning, kissing while they observed corporal punishment, as if the violence functioned in the background, like the noise of a factory in which both work and which does not require constant attention. Browning was also the one who, in the spring of 1943, made recruitment visits to the factories in the area, among them the Heinkel factory in Oranienburg, to convince female workers to leave assembly line work for the quiet and well-paid supervision of a re-education camp. Dozens of young working women accepted. When the Soviets advanced on Ravensbrück in April of 1945, the camp was evacuated in a death march toward the west. Binz fled on a bicycle. The British captured her on the 3rd of May of 1945 in Hamburg, without papers, without a clear identity. But the survivors recognized her immediately. She was interned in the former subcamp of Buchenwald in Recklinghausen, then transferred to the Hameln prison. The first Ravensbrück trial was held before a British military tribunal in Hamburg between December of 1946 and February of 1947. Binz was defendant number 5. 11 of the 16 defendants received the death penalty. On the 30th of April of 1947, when the confirmation of her sentence was read before her in the cell, Dorothea Binz tried to slit her wrists. The guards intervened before she could bleed to death. Recovered, she was transferred to the execution room. On the 2nd of May of 1947, at 9:01 in the morning, Albert Pierrepoint executed her in Hameln. She was 27 years old. Before they put the hood on her, she addressed the executioner. "I hope you do not think we are all bad people." Pierrepoint did not answer. He opened the trap door. On the 10th of September of 1893, Johanna Bormann was born in Birkenfelde in East Prussia, then at the furthest edge of the German Empire. She was the oldest of the 3 female guards executed on the same day as Irma Grace. When the Second World War began, she was 45 years old, was single, and had been working as a guard in the Nazi camp system for almost a year. In 1938, she applied for a job in Lichtenberg. Then she moved to Ravensbrück. In March of 1942, alongside a small group of veteran female guards, she was transferred to Auschwitz in the first months of operation of the women's camp in Birkenau. In Auschwitz, she spent 2 years. In March of 1944, they transferred her to her last destination, Bergen-Belsen. She was small in stature, of slight build. Testimonies described her this way with insistence, as if the contrast between her physique and her brutality resulted in itself disturbing. What made her fearsome was not her size, but the animals. Johanna Bormann trained her Alsatian dogs with a specific purpose: to attack female prisoners. She kept them in a state of controlled hunger that increased their aggressiveness. She released them. The prisoners called her Weasel, and the woman with the dogs. The testimony of Peter Makar, a Polish survivor, was presented before the Belsen Tribunal on the 23rd of September of 1945. Makar declared having recognized Bormann as the woman who had supervised the pig stables in Bergen-Belsen, and having witnessed on 2 different occasions how she released her dog against female prisoners without any observable provocation, solely to see the attack. Other testimonies described similar scenes in Auschwitz: Bormann selecting weak or sick women from the commando, releasing the dog against them in front of the line. The Belsen trial was the first major trial for war crimes after the Second World War, even before the Nuremberg Tribunal held its first session. It was in part an act of speed. Great Britain wanted to be the first Allied power to establish a precedent of international criminal justice. On the 17th of November of 1945, the British Military Tribunal in Lüneburg read the verdicts. Johanna Bormann was found guilty. The sentence was read in German: Tode durch den Strang, death by the rope. Witnesses said that Bormann listened to it as if she were in a dream. On the 13th of December of 1945 in Hameln, Bormann was executed at 10:38 in the morning, half an hour after Irma Grace. Albert Pierrepoint executed the 3 women that morning with intervals of half an hour between each execution. She was 52 years old. She was born as Elisabeth Muchlau on the 5th of September of 1919 in Schönau an der Katzbach in the region of Silesia, daughter of a worker. She left school without formal qualifications and worked as a hairdresser in her native village. She was 19 years old when the Reich began actively recruiting young female workers for the surveillance system. In 1941, she began her training as a guard in Ravensbrück. There, she showed the capabilities that supervisors looked for: obedience, toughness, willingness to exercise physical authority. She promoted. She was transferred to Auschwitz, where she reached the rank of Oberaufseherin, the highest-ranking guard in the women's system of the camp. Under her direct supervision were hundreds of Aufseherinnen and tens of thousands of female prisoners. She was the woman who transmitted orders from the male commander to the women's system of the camp. In the files of the Belsen trial, the profile that emerges from the testimonies about Volkenrath is not that of the spontaneous cruelty of Grez or the physical brutality of Braunsteiner, but that of the efficient administrator of terror. Her violence was functional, results-oriented, maintaining order in a camp whose size and level of overcrowding made chaos inevitable if there was no permanent coercion. In February of 1945, when Auschwitz was finally evacuated before the unstoppable advance of the Red Army, with more than 200,000 pairs of shoes, 43,000 pairs of glasses, and hundreds of tons of stored clothing as evidence of the millions murdered, Volkenrath was transferred to Bergen-Belsen as Oberaufseherin of the camp. She held the highest rank among the female staff there. Bergen-Belsen in those final months was a deliberate sanitary catastrophe. The camp had no gas chambers. It was a detention camp, not an extermination camp. But the conditions of overcrowding, hunger, and lack of water were equally deadly. In the period from January to April of 1945, more than 35,000 prisoners died there, the majority from typhus and starvation. Volkenrath was detained on the 15th of April of 1945, the day of the liberation of the camp by British troops. At the Belsen trial, she declared before the court with a phrase that the journalists present noted down for its shamelessness. "It was really horrible in the camps, but it was also horrible for us. We were punished just like the prisoners." The court heard this, took note, and continued with the next session. On the 13th of December of 1945, at 9:34 in the morning, Elisabeth Volkenrath was the first person to be executed in Hameln by order of the British Military Tribunal. She was 26 years old, the first to die that morning, the first woman executed in that prison under British military jurisdiction in the 20th century. Albert Pierrepoint, who would execute Gries and Bormann next, described in his memoirs that Volkenrath arrived at the execution room without visible resistance. She was born as Margaret Ilse Kohler on the 22nd of September of 1906 in Dresden. She worked as a librarian before politics changed everything. She joined the Nazi Party in 1932. On the 29th of May of 1937, she married Karl Otto Koch, an SS colonel who that summer was appointed commander of the new Buchenwald camp, 4.5 kilometers northwest of Weimar, in the forest where Goethe used to walk. Buchenwald was one of the first main camps of the Nazi system for men. Unlike Ravensbrück or Majdanek, it was not an extermination camp with gas chambers. It was a camp of forced labor and terror. At least 56,000 prisoners died there throughout its existence, the majority from exhaustion, disease, summary execution, or medical experiments. Ilse Koch had no official position within the administrative system of the camp. She was the wife of the commander. In Buchenwald, that granted her in practice more real power than most of the uniformed officials. The testimonies of survivors who declared before the courts described her as a figure who rode through the camp on horseback, whipping prisoners with her riding crop as she passed, who organized social events at the commander's residence while the smell of the crematoria reached through the windows. who lived at a level of obscene ostentation in the heart of the horror, with forced servants, with luxuries confiscated from the deportees, with the absolute power of someone who answers to no one except her husband. The best-known aspect of her case, and the most disputed historiographically, are the accusations about objects made from human skin. The claims of survivors, presented before the American courts in the Dachau trial in 1947, maintained that Koch had ordered the killing of prisoners with interesting tattoos and the use of their skin to make lampshades, bookbindings, and gloves. The lampshade that the American authorities exhibited as evidence disappeared before being forensically analyzed in detail. General Lucius Clay, the American military governor of the occupation zone, reduced the initial sentence of life imprisonment to 4 years in 1949, arguing insufficiency of evidence regarding the human skin objects specifically, which triggered a United States Senate investigation and a considerable political scandal. What was indeed documented and proven beyond any reasonable doubt: the active participation of Ilse Koch in the atmosphere of terror of the camp, the regular beatings of prisoners, the active complicity in the system that killed tens of thousands of people, the systematic pillaging of the belongings of the deportees. The only reason she was not sentenced to death in the American process was that she was pregnant at the time of the sentencing. Her fourth child, Uwe, was born in October of 1947 in the prison. Released in 1949 due to Clay's sentence reduction, she was detained the same day by West German authorities. A court in Augsburg tried her again in 1950–1951, this time for crimes against German citizens. On the 15th of January of 1951, she was sentenced to life imprisonment for incitement to murder. This time there was no sentence reduction. She spent the following years in the Eichach women's prison in Bavaria. She became progressively paranoid. She stopped sleeping regularly. According to reports from prison officials, she was convinced that the survivors of Buchenwald were coming to look for her. On the 1st of September of 1967, the day before 22 years were completed since the liberation of Buchenwald, the guards found Ilse Koch dead in her cell. She had hanged herself with the bedsheets. She was 60 years old. She left a note for her son Uwe. "Death is a liberation for me. There is no other way out." Birth records confirm the 30th of May of 1922 in Hamburg. The rest, in her childhood and adolescent years, is scarce. The documented history of Jenny Wanda Bachmann begins in 1944 when she was 21 years old and volunteered as an Aufseherin at the Stutthof camp. Stutthof was the oldest camp in the Nazi system outside the borders of the Reich proper. It had been opened on the 2nd of September of 1939, the day following the start of the invasion of Poland, in a swampy area 27 kilometers east of Danzig, at the mouth of the Vistula, where the air always had a salty taste and the humidity made mud permanent between the barracks. From 1942, it began to function as an extermination camp for Jews coming from the Baltic ghettos. The gas chambers of Stutthof were brick blocks of 4 square meters, operational since 1943. Bachmann was assigned to Sector 3 of the women's camp. In that sector were Jewish women coming from the Riga region, from the liquidated Vilnius ghetto, from transports from Hungary that arrived in the summer and autumn of 1944. The physical conditions were comparable to those of Birkenau at its worst moments: hunger, typhus, Baltic cold without adequate clothing. What survivors documented about Bachmann was her cruelty without apparent structure, without the framework of administrative efficiency that could be attributed to other guards. She beat female prisoners at roll calls for reasons impossible to predict. She personally selected women and children for the chambers. She had a smile that testimonies describe as terrifying in its context, because it appeared during the acts of greatest violence. Due to the combination of her physically attractive appearance and the unpredictability of her cruelty, the prisoners gave her a name that condensed the terror of that duality: the Beautiful Spectre. When the Red Army advanced across the Baltic in January of 1945, Stutthof began its evacuation. Bachmann fled. She was hidden for months in the city of Danzig, then under siege. She was detained in May of 1945 while trying to catch a train at the central station of Gdansk. She carried false documentation. A Polish agent recognized her. The first Stutthof trial was held in Gdansk between the 25th of April and the 31st of May of 1946. 13 defendants, 6 German female guards, Bachmann, Iwa Paradis, Elisabeth Becker, Wanda Klaff, Gerda Steinhoff, Erna Beilhardt, 1 SS officer and 6 Polish capos. The testimonies of dozens of survivors during the month of the trial built such a consistent picture of the activities of each defendant that even Bachmann's defense lawyer admitted in his closing argument that she was guilty of the facts, arguing only that she was mentally unstable. Bachmann did not cooperate with that defense. She changed her hairstyle every day during the trial. The guards who watched her testified that she flirted with them. When the verdict of guilt was read, Bachmann responded, "Life is indeed a pleasure, and pleasures usually do not last long." On the 4th of July of 1946, on the Biskupia Gorka Hill, in the outskirts of Gdansk, 11 condemned individuals from the Stutthof trial were publicly executed. The method chosen by the Polish authorities was short drop hanging. The condemned were placed standing on military trucks with the noose around their necks. The trucks drove off. The fall was not enough to break the neck. Death arrived by asphyxiation in several minutes. Former prisoners of Stutthof had volunteered to act as executioners. It was calculated that about 200,000 people attended the executions at Biskupia Gorka. Jenny Wanda Bachmann was executed among the 5 women who died that morning. She was 24 years old. In Majdanek, the prisoners called her Bloody Brigida. The nickname was not poetic but documentary. There were specific episodes with witnesses that survivors consistently repeated over decades in the Polish interrogations of 1947, in the German statements of the 70s, and before the Dusseldorf Tribunal in 1975-1981. Hildegard Martha Lachert was born on the 19th of March of 1920 in Berlin, daughter of a metal worker in the industrial districts of the capital. She grew up in the Berlin of the Weimar Republic. Inflation, massive unemployment, the political violence of the streets, and finished primary school in 1934. She began an apprenticeship as a seamstress, abandoning it in 1937. She had a child out of wedlock in August of 1939. The father is not registered. In September of 1939, she was sent to work in a munitions factory. In 1941, she had a daughter, also out of wedlock. She worked as a Red Cross nurse in a Luftwaffe hospital in Berlin, and in March of 1942, according to her own words before the Dusseldorf Tribunal, they sent me as an Aufseherin to the Ravensbrück concentration camp. 4 weeks of training. On the 16th of October of 1942, Hildegard Lachert arrived in Majdanek in the same group as Hermine Braunsteiner, the first 10 female guards of the camp. She was assigned as Blockführerin, responsible for the barracks of the women's camp. Her 2 children had remained with her mother in Berlin. While Lachert worked in Majdanek, she regularly sent a portion of her salary for the support of the family. The head of the camp, Elsa Erich, mentioned it explicitly in a 1943 report. It was the only source of income for her children. The same report by Erich, also from 1943, characterized Lachert in terms that revealed the tension between her behavior inside and outside the camp. With her unusually tense and nervous way of acting, Aufseherin Lachert does not make a good impression on the prisoners. As soon as she takes control of a commando, she begins to lash out at the prisoners. She has received numerous official reprimands regarding this. Off-duty, Aufseherin Lachert maintains very good relations with the other guards. She is very good-natured and has never caused trouble. That document was presented before the Dusseldorf Tribunal in 1981. What Erich called lashing out at the prisoners had been precisely documented by dozens of survivors over decades. Lachert beat with the whip during roll calls, sometimes during the march to work, sometimes without visible cause. But what crystallized in the memory of those who survived and testified was something else: the candy. Lachert would approach groups of newcomers with small children, take candy out of her uniform pocket, smile and call them over. The children would approach, Then she would lead them to the trucks. A testimony presented at the Dusseldorf trial described having seen her next to the camp gallows during the execution of a female prisoner who had attempted to escape. The body was left hanging all night by order of the camp. Lachert was on guard until she was relieved at dawn. The next day, the body was still on the gallows, blue, according to the witness. That day, the prisoners were forced to march in front of the scaffold. She also attended the selections, the operations in which prisoners who would be executed immediately were separated from those who would be used as labor. Her name appears in several testimonies as a guard present during the selections of November of 1943, including the massacre of the 3rd of November of that year, the Erntefest, the Harvest Festival, in which more than 18,000 Jews were shot to death in the extermination camps of the General Government in a single day. In Majdanek alone, more than 17,000 people died that day. In 1944, she was transferred to Auschwitz. She fled in December of 1944 before the Soviet advance. In July of 1945, she was back in Berlin, working in an American hospital under a false name. Her crimes had not yet been discovered. Later, she went to Austria to continue as a nurse. In 1947, she was captured and extradited to Poland. The Supreme National Tribunal sentenced her to 15 years in prison for crimes in Auschwitz. She was released by amnesty on the 7th of December of 1956. She had served a little over 9 years. In the following years, she received compensation of 6,000 German marks from the West German authorities as reparation for the years of Polish imprisonment, according to the records of the case. It was the same bureaucratic system that would pay victims of Nazism. In 1975, investigators from the Ministry of Justice of North Rhine-Westphalia located her in Berlin. She was 55 years old. They prosecuted her as a defendant in the 3rd Majdanek trial in Dusseldorf. On the 30th of June of 1981, she was sentenced to 12 years in prison as an accessory to murder, the second most severe sentence of the trial. In front of the courthouse, a demonstration of survivors and young Germans protested against what they considered insufficient sentences. Hildegard Lachert, Bloody Brigida, was released after serving her sentence. She died on the 14th of April of 1995 in Berlin at 75 years old. Post-war Polish police reports called her just that, the woman from the SS picture book. Tall, blonde, of classic Nordic appearance, the physical type that the Reich's propaganda poster designers would have chosen to represent the ideal guard. The disparity between that appearance and what she did was part of what survivors remembered most clearly. Alice Minna Elizabeth Elling was born on the 30th of September of 1903 in Berlin. She studied medicine for 4 semesters, unusual for a woman of her generation, a sign of a family with resources and ambitions, before abandoning her studies. Her father was a chief tax inspector. She was the only Aufseherin in Majdanek with a university education, a fact that subsequent trial files highlight because it makes the most common defense argument impossible: cultural ignorance, deficient education, the incapacity for autonomous ethical reasoning. She began her training as a guard in Ravensbrück in 1941. She did not last even a week in Ravensbrück before being transferred directly to Majdanek in October of 1942. She arrived in the first contingent along with Braunsteiner and Lachert. In Majdanek, she was promoted to Kommandoführerin in the sorting warehouses, the area where more than 100 female prisoners worked under her direct supervision, sorting items confiscated from gas-chambered prisoners: pocket watches, fur coats, gold coins, jewelry, children's toys, glasses, dental prosthetics. The objects arrived in wheelbarrows from the gas chamber zones. Prisoners who did not work quickly enough or who were caught keeping an object were beaten. Orlowski had a specialty. When transports arrived and the women were led through the gates, Orlowski waited. As the lines passed before her, she would raise her whip and strike the prisoners in the face, specifically in the eyes. Survivor testimonies describe her with this specificity for more than 30 years, in statements taken in completely different circumstances by different investigators in different countries. The detail is repeated with too much consistency to be a later elaboration. Along with Hermine Braunsteiner, Orlowski is mentioned in the trial files as one of the two most brutal guards of Majdanek, though with different styles. Where Braunsteiner kicked and beat with a work-like regularity, Orlowski looked for the precise moment of maximum impact. When an overcrowded transport arrived and the truck going to the chambers was already full and a child was left over without space, Orlowski and Braunsteiner would throw him on top of the piled adults like luggage and close the door. In January of 1945, during the evacuation of Auschwitz toward the west, Orlowski had been transferred there in 1944. Something changed in her behavior abruptly. On the death march toward Loslau, she began to bring water to exhausted prisoners, to share food, to sleep on the ground next to them when there was no shelter. The survivors who testified decades later had no explanation for the change. They speculated that Orlowski understood the war was ending and that there would be consequences. Soviet forces captured her in May of 1945. She was extradited to Poland. In the Auschwitz trial of Krakow in 1947, she was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Released in 1957 by Amnesty. In 1975, German investigators located her again. She was 71 years old and included her among the defendants of the third Majdanek trial in Dusseldorf. Alice Orlowski died during the course of the proceedings in 1976, at 73 years old, without the court having issued a sentence. There is a phrase that archivists of the post-war German judicial system have to write with some regularity in the files of Nazi crimes: case closed due to the death of the defendant. In the case of Louise Dance, that phrase had to wait until the 21st of June of 2009. Louise Elizabeth Helene Dance was born on the 11th of December of 1917 in Waldorf, Thuringia, the same village in Thuringia where she would end her days, less than 5 kilometers from where Erna Petri would commit her own crimes 2 decades later, although the two women never met as far as records indicate. Dance left primary school at 14 years old. She worked for several years in a bakery in Brandenburg, then as a postal assistant in Schmalkalden. In January of 1943, the local employment office informed her that she had been selected to work as a guard in Ravensbrück. In her subsequent statement before the Krakow tribunal, she said she tried to reject the assignment and failed. On the 1st of March of 1943, she began a 3-week course in Ravensbrück. On the 22nd of March of 1943, she was transferred to Majdanek, where she supervised work commandos in the camp tailor shop, in the kitchen, in the prisoner nursery, and in the clothing warehouse. In 1943, she received an award from the Nazi administration for distinguished services in the camp. From Majdanek, she was transferred to Krakow-Plazow, then to Auschwitz-Birkenau, and finally to the Malchow subcamp, dependent on Ravensbrück, where she continued until the end of the war. In each of these stages, survivor testimonies place her in the direct supervision of female prisoners under conditions of systematic brutality. Survivor Halina Nelken remembered her specifically in Plazow with descriptions that her defense lawyers in Krakow tried without success to present as exaggerated. She was captured by Allied forces in 1945 and extradited to Poland. In the Auschwitz trial of Krakow in December of 1947, she was sentenced to life imprisonment. On the 20th of August of 1957, 10 years after the sentence, she was released under the general Polish amnesty for convicted war criminals. She returned to Waldorf. In 1996, when she was 78 years old, she was arrested again in Germany on renewed charges related to her activities in the camps. The charges were dismissed for procedural reasons before reaching trial. Louise Dance lived the rest of her life in Waldorf, the same village where she had been born. She died on the 21st of June of 2009 at 91 years old. She was the last known female Nazi guard to die. Johanna Altvater was 22 years old when she arrived in Volodymyr Wolyński, on the border between Ukraine and Poland, in September of 1941. She was the personal secretary of the new German regional commissioner. She came from Minden in Westphalia, daughter of a foreman at an iron foundry. Her file in the USHMEM archives describes her as a woman with social ambitions who saw service in the Eastern Territories as an opportunity for advancement and stability that Minden could not offer her. Volodymyr Volynski, Vladimir Wolinsk in the German name assigned by the occupiers, was a city of 30,000 inhabitants at the confluence of the Bug and Luga rivers, surrounded by wheat fields and swamp forests. Before the war, it had a Jewish community of about 20,000 people, mostly in the urban center. The regional commissioner, Wilhelm Westerheide, arrived in October of 1941 and immediately began his version of the local Endlosung. The historian Wendy Lower, in her research published by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt in 2013, documented Altvater's role through Polish and German trial files, survivor statements collected by the USHMM, and West German court archives. On the 16th of September of 1942, Johanna Altvater entered the ghetto with gendarme Keller. She walked up to two children standing by the ghetto wall, one 6 years old, a baby of a few months. She made a gesture as if she were going to give them something. The baby moved toward her. Altvater grabbed him, lifted him, and slammed him against the ghetto wall with the force of someone shaking a rug. She threw him at the father's feet. The father, who survived the war and testified decades later before Polish and German investigators, said, "Such sadism in a woman I had never seen. I will never forget this." There were no other Germans present. Altvater did it on her own. In other actions, she was seen leading groups of Jews to deportation trucks, patrolling the ghetto with her whip, making cracking sounds like a drover, according to the description of a German officer from the nearby prisoner camp who observed her from a distance. She entered the building that functioned as an improvised ghetto hospital during a liquidation. She went from bed to bed looking at the sick children. She took one in her arms, carried him to the second-floor balcony, and threw him to the pavement. She pushed others from the balcony. Not all died in the fall. The wounded were loaded onto the trucks along with those going to the execution site. Another testimony, collected in the Simon Wiesenthal archives in Vienna, describes her offering candy to the children of the ghetto. When they opened their mouths to receive them, she would pull out the small silver pistol she always carried with her and shoot them in the mouth. There was also the matter of entertainment around the mass execution pits. The records of the case describe a scene on the outskirts of Volodymyr Volynski in the fields of Piatidny where Jews were taken to die. A large table, music, drinking, German officials eating and drinking between salvos, standing up at intervals to participate in the shootings and returning to the table. Altvater was sitting at that table. There was also the matter of entertainment around the mass execution pits. The records of the case describe a scene on the outskirts of Volodymyr Volynski in the fields of Piatidny where Jews were taken to die. A large table, music, drinking, German officials eating and drinking between salvos, standing up at intervals to participate in the shootings and returning to the table. Altvater was sitting at that table. Between the summer of 1942 and the winter of 1943, the Jewish population of the region went from 20,000 to fewer than 500 people. At the end of 1943, Altvater was sent back to the Reich before the Soviets advanced on the region. According to her own file, she was transferred for disciplinary reasons after she and other officials led a cow inside the ghetto in what documents describe as an unspecified form of amusement. She returned to Germany. The German and Austrian prosecutors who investigated crimes in the Eastern Territories in the 50s reviewed her file. They decided not to prosecute her. Her defense was simple. She was just a secretary. Johanna Altvater was never tried. There is no record of a conviction or a concluded judicial investigation. The exact date of her death is not known. Liesel Riedel grew up in the Saargebiet, the border region between Germany and France, whose political future was decided by a referendum in January of 1935. 91% of the population voted to integrate into the Third Reich. In Saarbrücken, Hitler delivered his victory speech. Finally, blood is stronger than all documents of mere paper. Liesel Riedel, daughter of a foreman at an iron foundry, was working then as a typist for a local newspaper of the Nazi movement. she met Gustav Wilhaus, a party activist who beat communists and socialists on the streets of Saarbrücken during the agitation campaign prior to the referendum. They married on the 30th of October of 1935 without the official permission of the SS required by the matrimonial regulations of the Corps. Gustav had not completed the genealogical documentation demonstrating his racial purity, and furthermore, he was Protestant while Liesel was Catholic, which complicated the SS forms regarding the racially correct education of future children. Neither of those obstacles stopped them. In May of 1939, their daughter was born, whom they named Heike. Gustav completed his military training in the Waffen-SS and was assigned to the Wirtschafts- und Verwaltungshauptamt of the SS in Berlin. In March of 1942, he was sent to Lviv in western Ukraine to take command of the Jews forced to work in the local arms industry. His efficiency impressed his superiors, and he was promoted to commander of the Janowska camp, the largest forced labor and transit camp in Ukraine. In the villa assigned to the commander in front of the camp, he ordered a balcony to be built on the first floor. In the summer of 1942, Liesel and Heike, who was 3 years old, arrived in Janowska. The testimonies presented before the International Military Tribunal of Nuremberg in February of 1946 in the file regarding the extermination of Jews in Eastern Europe included statements from survivors describing what happened from that balcony. Gustav Wilhaus shot with an automatic rifle at the prisoners working in the workshops below, according to one statement, partly out of pure sporting pleasure and partly to entertain his wife and his daughter. Then he would pass the weapon to Liesel. Liesel shot too. To entertain Heike, they threw children between 2 and 4 years old into the air and shot them while the girl clapped and screamed, "Daddy, again, again, Daddy!" The testimony was read aloud in the Nuremberg court on the 14th of February of 1946. Liesel's favorite weapon for her own shooting sessions was a Flober pistol, an elegant-looking small-caliber French salon weapon usually used for entertainment shooting in private gardens. Its range did not exceed 30 meters, sufficient from the balcony to the prisoners working at the front of the camp. Survivors of the Janowska camp described Liesel shooting on different occasions. A Sunday in September of 1942 at a group of prisoners collecting garbage near the villa, on a Sunday in April of 1943 with her daughter by her side, and mentioned that sometimes the victims did not die immediately from the first shot. Janowska was finally liquidated in November of 1943. Gustav Wilhaus was transferred to the Croatian Volunteer Division of the Waffen-SS. He died on the Western Front in March of 1945. Liesel Wilhaus survived the war. The documentation of what happened to her afterward is fragmentary. She was not criminally prosecuted by any court. The West German investigations of the 50s did not prosecute her. The testimonies incriminating her had been collected by the Extraordinary Soviet Commission during the liberation, and accessing those sources from West Germany was complicated during the Cold War. There is no record of a trial or a conviction. Erna Kurbs was born on the 30th of May of 1920 in Heressen, Thuringia, a village of a few hundred people 15 kilometers from Weimar. The Kurbs family had been farming the same land for generations. At 16 years old, at a local dance, she met Horst Petri, a young man from the region with political ambitions within the orbit of agrarian Nazism. Horst was an agronomy student with mentors in the highest spheres of the Rasse- und Siedlungshauptamt, the SS office that supervised the racial colonization of the Eastern Territories. Richard Walter Dahre, the ideologue of blood and soil, who saw the German peasant as the archetype of racial purity, had taken him under his protection. Horst graduated from the University of Jena and trained as an SS officer in Buchenwald and Dachau. Erna became pregnant within a year of dating. The Rasse- und Siedlungshauptamt gave its blessing to the marriage in July of 1938. Erna was 18 years old. Erna's father did not approve of Horst, but it was too late. Their son Horst Jr. was born in November of 1938. In the summer of 1942, the regime assigned Horst the administration of the Grzenda estate in Polish Hriada, in eastern Galicia, within occupied Poland, about 20 kilometers from Lviv. It was an old Polish manor estate with a white-columned villa, well-kept gardens, and a view over hills and meadows. Up to 150 Jewish forced laborers lived and worked there under the administration of the Patrice. Erna arrived with her young son in June of 1942. 2 days after her arrival, she already saw her husband beating the workers. The domestic female workers were assaulted by him. The local peasants described him as someone who enjoyed violence. Erna also began to beat the workers, including the estate blacksmith. Violence was the daily language of Grzenda. In the spring of 1943, Erna arrived at the estate in a carriage returning from Lviv, where she had been shopping. On the road, she saw something she at first confused. As the carriage approached, she recognized that they were children, between 6 and 14 years old, in rags, some barefoot, crouching at the side of the road. She understood immediately that they were Jews who had escaped from a transport at the Sashko station, whose destination was the extermination camps. She recognized them as Jews because the deportees were stripped before the transports to easily distinguish them from the Ukrainian population. She took them to the estate. She gave them food from the kitchen. The children calmed down and trusted her. Horst was not at the estate. Erna waited for a while. Horst did not arrive. She went to the bedroom and took her father's pistol, a weapon her father had given her as a farewell gift when she left for Ukraine, a revolver from the First World War. She led the children to the woods that she and Horst used as an execution site for the Jews of the estate. She made them stand in a line with their backs to her next to the pit. She placed the weapon 10 centimeters from the back of the neck of the first one and fired. After the second shot, those who remained began to cry. They did not cry loudly, they whimpered, she stated herself, but none tried to flee. They were too exhausted. Erna executed them all. Years later, in the East German Stasi interrogations in 1961, she described the number as 4 adult Jews and 6 children. The file of the proceedings indicates that the total number of victims on the Grzenda estate was much larger. When the interrogator asked her how she could, being a mother of 2 children, kill those children, she replied, "At that time, when I participated in the shootings, I was only 25 years old. I was young and inexperienced. I did not want to fall behind the SS men. I wanted to show them that I, as a woman, could behave like a man. So I killed 4 Jews and 6 Jewish children. I wanted to prove myself to the men." In 1962, an East German court tried Erna and Horst Petri. Horst was executed by guillotine on the 15th of September of 1962. Erna was sentenced to life imprisonment. She spent more than 30 years in prison. She was released in 1992. She died in July of 2000. She was born on the 5th of July of 1920 in Breslau, the industrial city of Silesia that is now Wrocław, daughter of the working class. She worked as a domestic cook until she was 19 years old. What makes Ruth Closius-Neudeck different from most of the female guards appearing in this script is the date she entered the system. On the 26th of August of 1939, she presented herself at the local SS office. They sent her to Ravensbrück. But it was not until July of 1944, 5 years after her entry when the war was already militarily decided, when her period of documented criminal activity began, that would lead her to the scaffold. She was assigned to Ravensbrück in that final summer. She promoted to Blockführerin, responsible for barracks, within weeks. Her ferocity was recognized and promoted immediately in a system that could no longer be demanding with candidates because it needed personnel and needed it now. Geneviève de Gaulle Antonio, niece of General Charles de Gaulle, deported to Ravensbrück as a resistance fighter from the Bureau Central de Renseignement et d'Action Network, a survivor who testified before the post-war courts and published her memoirs in 1998, testified to having seen Neudeck slit the throat of a female prisoner with the edge of the shovel she was carrying. Another survivor stated that Neudeck stripped some inmates of their clothes, poured cold water over them, and made them stand in the cold for hours. In December of 1944, with 3 months of active service, she was promoted to Oberaufseherin and transferred to the Uckermark complex, a subcamp located a short distance from Ravensbrück. In its final weeks of operation, that subcamp had been transformed by the Reich authorities into an improvised liquidation center. Prisoners too sick or weak to work were transferred there and selected for the gas chamber or direct execution. Ruth Closius participated in those selections. The files of the Third Ravensbrück trial attribute to the Uckermark operations under her partial supervision the deaths of more than 5,000 women and girls. In March of 1945, she was transferred to the Bath subcamp on the Baltic coast, where she continued until the evacuation of the camp. She fled when the Allies advanced. British forces captured her. The survivors living in the camp area recognized her and confirmed her identity. The Third Ravensbrück trial, also known as the Uckermark trial, was the smallest process of the 4 Ravensbrück trials. 5 women accused, held between the 14th and the 26th of April of 1948. 2 were acquitted, 2 received prison sentences. Ruth Closius Neudeck was condemned to death. On the 29th of July of 1948, Albert Pierrepoint executed her in Hameln. She was 28 years old. Therese Brandl was born on the 1st of February of 1902 in Staudach-Eggendach, a rural municipality in the district of Traunstein, in the heart of Alpine Bavaria. She was a woman of the countryside, from the world of agriculture and a small, closed community. There is no record of political militancy before her incorporation into the Nazi system. In March of 1942, Brandl was assigned to the Auschwitz camp, the original camp, distinct from the mass extermination of Birkenau. There, her duties included the supervision of women in the sorting sheds for confiscated items and the position of SS Rapportaufseherin, the guard who organized roll calls and recorded disciplinary infractions for the women's camp. In October of 1942, with the expansion of the camps, she was transferred to Auschwitz II Birkenau. She remained in the Auschwitz system until January of 1945, when the camp was evacuated before the Soviet advance. The file of the Krakow trial documented her participation in the selections. The operations on the arrival ramps, where prisoners who would go to the gas chambers were separated from those who would be used as labor. The presence of a Rapportaufseherin at those selections was not accidental. It was part of the logistics of the process. She was detained by American forces in May of 1945 in the mountains of Bavaria, sent to a detention camp while her case was investigated, and finally extradited to Poland to appear before the Supreme National Tribunal of Krakow. The Auschwitz trial began on the 24th of November of 1947 and ended on the 22nd of December of 1947. 40 defendants, including 4 women, Maria Mandl, Therese Brandl, Hildegard Laschert, and Alice Orlowski. The testimonies of survivors who declared during that month of proceedings built the file that determined the sentences. Brandl was found guilty of participating in the selections for the gas chambers and sentenced to death. Her execution was set for the same day as that of Maria Mandl. On the 24th of January of 1948, in the Montelupich prison in Krakow, Therese Brandl was executed by hanging alongside Maria Mandl and 6 other condemned individuals, the same morning, the same prison. She was 45 years old, 1 week away from turning 46. Emma Anna Maria Zimmer, born Mezell on the 14th of August of 1888 in Hasmersheim, Grand Duchy of Baden in southwestern Germany, was one of the foundational figures of the Nazi female guard system. When she arrived at Lichtenberg in 1938, she had already been working for years in the civilian prison system. She was the veteran, the one who knew how things worked before the affairs of the Reich took the shape they would later assume. In Lichtenberg, the castle converted into a camp for political women. She was appointed Oberaufseherin. Under her direct command were some of the most lethal guards in the system: Maria Mandl, who explicitly cites her as her trainer, and Dorothea Binz, who began under her orders at Ravensbrück. When Lichtenberg closed in 1939 and its population was transferred to the new Ravensbrück camp, Zimmer went with them, maintaining her position. She was building something. It was not just a camp, it was a replicable system, a model of organizing female terror that could be deployed on a large scale. And Zimmer was one of the people transmitting that model from one generation of guards to the next. Her style was different from that of the younger and more spectacularly violent guards. Zimmer was not known for spontaneous cruelty. Testimonies from Ravensbrück survivors describe her as someone who exercised power through the architecture of fear rather than through direct blows. The signed order, the authorized punishment, the relentless logic of rules applied without exception. In 1942, she was briefly transferred to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where her experience in managing female personnel was needed to establish the new guard system. She returned to Ravensbrück, where she continued until the end of the war. She was tried in the first Ravensbrück trial, held before a British military tribunal in Hamburg between December of 1946 and February of 1947. The court deliberated on the testimonies of dozens of survivors. Emma Zimmer was sentenced to death. On the 20th of September of 1948, Emma Zimmer was executed in the Hameln prison. She was 60 years old. She was the oldest of the guards executed in the Ravensbrück trials, and it was the last documented execution of a female Nazi guard by Allied courts. Pauline Kneissler was born on the 10th of March of 1900, daughter of a wealthy landowner. From a young age, she wanted to be a nurse. In 1939, when she was 39 years old, she was working as a nurse in the public health system of the Reich when she received an offer to participate in a secret medical operation of the state. The T4 program, Aktion T4, named after the address of the administrative office that managed it at Tiergartenstraße 4, Berlin, was the systematic program of extermination of people with physical or mental disabilities, whom the regime labeled lives unworthy of life. It began in 1939, and before being officially suspended in 1941, though it continued in a decentralized manner until the end of the war, it had killed more than 200,000 people in Germany, Austria, and the occupied territories. The first victims were babies and children. Pediatricians and midwives of the Reich received instructions to notify authorities of any newborn with physical or mental malformations. Families were pressured to hand over those children to specialized clinics that were, in reality, extermination centers. In Grafeneck, Hartheim, Hadamar, Bernburg, and other centers, patients were led into gas rooms disguised as shower facilities or murdered with lethal injections. Pauline Kneissler was assigned first to Grafeneck in Baden-Württemberg, then transferred to Hadamar, and finally to Irsee in Bavaria. In her statement to American Army investigators in 1946, collected in the archives of the Nuremberg trials, she was direct in a way that was exceptional even among the participants of the program. It was completely voluntary. We were informed of the program and simply given a few minutes to reflect on whether we wanted to participate or not. We did not feel very good about it, but we had no moral objections. In Irsee, she was the only nurse at the center who personally administered lethal injections to patients. The others left that part of the process to the doctors. Kneissler carried it out directly. She stated she had killed between 100 and 150 people in this manner. The T4 program used its medical professionals in a second phase, sending them to the Eastern Territories as personnel for the extermination camps of Operation Reinhard, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka. The gas chambers of those centers were designed and operated largely by veterans of the T4 program. The technicians, drivers, nurses, and doctors who had learned to kill in the sanatoriums of the Reich were the founding core of the most lethal extermination apparatus in history. Kneissler was also sent to the east. According to a statement she made to a friend, which the latter subsequently reported to investigators, in Soviet field hospitals near Minsk, she administered lethal injections to seriously wounded German soldiers or those with irreversible brain damage, presenting it as acts of mercy. This aspect of her activity was never formally prosecuted. In 1948, a post-war German court prosecuted her for the crimes of T4. She was sentenced to 4 years in prison as an accessory to murder. the penalty that the German judicial system at that time considered appropriate for someone who had killed between 100 and 150 people. She was released in 1949. She worked as a psychiatric nurse in Berlin from 1950 until her retirement in 1963. Pauline Neisler died in 1989 at 89 years old. Gertrude Segel was the daughter of an SS commander and was working as a secretary at the Gestapo headquarters in Vienna when she met Felix Landau. It was 1941, and Landau was the head of the SIPO and the SD in Radom, Poland. He was a married man with 2 children. Gertrude had a fiancé at the front, an Austrian soldier who was not a member of the SS. In a matter of months, Gertrude had broken her engagement to the soldier, and Felix had filed for divorce from his wife, who was also a secretary in his office, and had left his young children in Drohobych, Ukraine, with his new girlfriend, whom he had transferred to that destination from Radom. Felix Landau was known in Drohobych as the Jude General, the General of the Jews, an ironic nickname that locals used to refer to his absolute control over the life and death of the local Jewish community. In his personal diary, which was discovered after the war, Landau described the mass executions in which he participated with the same tone one might use to describe an especially intense workday mixed with love letters to Gertrude. Investigators from the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Vienna located and prosecuted him decades later. Landau was also the man who had hired the Jewish writer and artist Bruno Schulz, one of the great narrators of 20th century Polish literature, author of The Cinnamon Shops, to paint murals in his office and in his son's playroom. Schulz was murdered on the street in Drohobych on the 19th of November of 1942 by another Gestapo officer who had an outstanding score to settle with Landau. It was an episode of internal bureaucratic violence, absurd even within the logic of genocide. Gertrude Segel lived with Landau in the villa that the Nazis had confiscated from a Jewish family in Drohobych. The interior walls still featured Schulz's murals. The house was filled with items stolen from the deportees, fur coats, paintings, porcelain. On the 14th of June of 1942, a Sunday afternoon, Gertrude and Felix were on the balcony of the villa playing cards. They had turned the radio up loud. The sun was bright. Gertrude was wearing a swimsuit, Felix a white suit. A group of Jews was working in the garden below, spreading soil. Felix took the Flaubert pistol and began shooting at pigeons. Gertrude tried to take aim as well. Then, witnesses who survived did not agree on which of the two did it first. One of the parlor pistols was aimed at the Jewish gardeners. One of them, a man named Fliegner, fell dead. Felix and Gertrude laughed and went inside the house. Jacob Goldstein, a survivor who testified before Austrian investigators, also stated that Gertrude had ordered the death of 3 household maids, Jewish forced laborers, and that on another occasion she had kicked a Jewish child to death. Austrian and West German investigators reviewed those testimonies in the late 50s. They decided not to prosecute her. Gertrude Segel Landau was never tried. The statements of the survivors, compiled in archives that Wendy Lower examined for her research published in 2013, are documented. The crimes are documented. The archive exists. The impunity does as well. Johanna Langefeld was the first Oberaufseherin of Ravensbrück. She was the woman who in 1939 sat at the head of the table when the Reich's female guard system was being built from scratch. Every single one of the female guards appearing in this script, all those who passed through Ravensbrück, which was almost all of them, came at some point under her authority or under the system she helped to establish. She was born in 1900 in Westphalia. Before the Nazi system, she worked as a civilian prison guard, a background that was considered sufficient to make her the reference figure who organized the recruitment, training and deployment of the first mass generations of Aufseherinnen. Survivor Margaret Buber-Neumann, a political prisoner in Ravensbrück since August of 1940 and assigned to work in the office of the chief female guard, left a portrait of Langefeld that is one of the few first-hand testimonies regarding the internal workings of the camp's female hierarchy. Buber-Neumann, who published her memoirs in 1949 under the title Als Gefangene bei Stalin und Hitler, described Langerfeld as a woman who genuinely believed in the camp's mission as an institution of re-education, a belief that put her in permanent tension with the system she herself served, given that Ravensbrück was in reality a center of terror, forced labor, and systematic murder. It was also Langerfeld who described the recruiter Browning visiting weapons factories to convince female workers to leave the assembly line for the quiet and well-paid work of supervising a re-education camp. The demand for female personnel was so high that the difference between voluntary recruitment and coercion was already a very fine line by 1942. In October of 1942, Langerfeld was transferred to Auschwitz as Oberaufseherin of the women's camp. The relationship with the male commander of the complex was tense from the very first moment. SS internal documentation shows frictions over the line of authority between the male and female command. Langerfeld was returned to Ravensbrück after a short time in a position of lesser importance. In 1946, she was taken to Poland to testify in the Auschwitz trial. She escaped from Polish custody under circumstances that the files document imprecisely. The most cited version speaks of an escape facilitated by contacts in the Catholic Church and managed to reach Bavaria under a false identity. She lived the rest of her life in West Germany under relative anonymity. The authorities knew her whereabouts. Prosecutors evaluated the file and did not prosecute it. Johanna Langerfeld died in 1974. The woman who laid the foundations of the system that trained Irma Gries, Dorothea Binz, and Hermine Braunsteiner died in her bed. 20 women, 8 executed, 4 who died in prison or while serving their sentences, 2 who committed suicide, 6 who were never tried or who escaped the full judicial consequences of their actions. The 8 who were executed, Irma Gries, Elisabeth Volkenrath, Johanna Bormann, Dorothea Binz, Maria Mandl, Therese Brandl, Emma Zimmer, Ruth Closius Neudeck, Jenny Wanda Bachmann, died between 1945 and 1948, in the years immediately following the war, when the political will of the Allies to establish criminal responsibilities was still active. Those who survived that window of time, some because they had escaped, like Langerfeld, some because prosecutors decided their role was too marginal or the evidence too difficult to gather, like Altvater. Some because the post-war German legal system lacked either the instruments or always the will to retroactively prosecute everyone responsible for the Holocaust, lived with their crimes in very different ways. Ilse Koch slowly went insane and hanged herself with her own sheets. Hermine Braunsteiner was the kind housewife from Queens until the day the New York Times knocked on her door. Alice Orlowski died during her trial. Louise Dans lived to be 91 years old and died in the same village where she had been born. What the historical documents gathered in Elissa Mailander's studies on Magdanek and Wendy Lower's on German women in the Eastern Territories allow us to point out is that the Nazi system did not recruit monsters. It recruited ammunition factory workers, housekeepers, unqualified nurses, provincial typists, daughters of blacksmiths and brewery drivers. And within that system, with its hierarchy of command, its racial ideology, its daily normalization of violence, and its promise of economic stability for women without clear prospects, some of those women became the actors in the greatest crime of the 20th century. And then the system collapsed, and some paid, and others did not. The disparity between some and others does not have a simple explanation. In some cases it was geographical chance, who was captured by the British, who reached the American zone, who managed to cross into West Germany before the Soviets closed the routes. In others it was the weight of the available evidence or the priority of prosecutors toward larger-scale crimes. In others, simply time. Each year that passed between the crime and the potential trial made witnesses scarcer, memories more disputed, and a conviction harder to sustain before a court. What remains free of ambiguity are the facts. The gas chambers worked, the crematoria worked, the death marches left bodies on the roads, and in each of those operations, alongside the SS men who directed them, there were women with a whip or a grey uniform or a French parlor pistol looking out from a balcony doing their job.